Everything happened too quickly. The plane began to lose altitude and the cabin was filled with panic and screams. I closed my eyes, trying to calm the chaos around me, but nothing prepared me for what came next. The impact was devastating. When I opened my eyes again, I was alone. A survivor, surrounded by the wreckage of the crash. Now the only thing left for me is to fight to live, while the echoes of the accident continue to haunt me. I have always loved flying. Since I was little, I watched planes streak across the sky and dreamed of one day being part of it. When I got my job as a flight attendant, it felt like the universe was finally aligning. Being in the air gave me an incomparable feeling of freedom, as if nothing could reach me up there. The crew became my second family, and despite all the tiredness of the long journeys, that was the place I wanted to be. That day, on board flight AZ-402, everything seemed normal. My colleagues Claire and Emily and I were busy with preparations before takeoff. Claire was a 41-year-old veteran with years of experience, while Emily, like me, was still feeling the excitement of new adventures. Captain Dan Reynolds, a respected pilot, greeted us with his traditional confident smile. Next to him was the co-pilot, Michael Thompson, an experienced and calm man, with more than 5,000 hours of flying. It was an ordinary trip, from New York to Chicago. Everything seemed to follow the routine until mid-flight something changed. I was serving drinks to passengers when the noise started. A low sound at first, but it grew, an irregular hum that made us all stop. It wasn't normal. I saw Claire looking toward the cabin, clearly worried. I tried to remain calm, instructed by years of training. We have faced turbulence before, and technical problems happen. But there was something different this time. The tension in the air was palpable. I looked at Emily, who now had shaking hands. "It's going to be okay," I said, trying to reassure her and perhaps convince myself too. What came next, however, was far from normal. A series of violent jolts made the plane rock like never before. Passengers began to scream. I heard the captain's voice over the intercom. "Crew, brace for impact." These words, simple and direct, fell on me like a storm. Impact? That wasn't in the script. My heart raced. What was once a routine flight quickly turned into a nightmare. I ran down the aisle trying to help the passengers get ready. The plane was now descending at a terrifying speed. It was then that Claire shouted, "Sit down and get ready." I obeyed without thinking, fastening my belt and squinting. The sound of the engine failing, the wind whistling against the fuselage, the sound of screams. All this chaos mixed together and seemed to last an eternity. And suddenly, silence. When I opened my eyes, everything was distorted. The wreckage of the plane was scattered everywhere. Smoke and fire rose into the sky. The smell of burning fuel filled the air. My body hurt, but I was alive. I survived. My hands shook as I unclipped myself from my seatbelt. All around me, the sight was one of pure horror. I could see parts of the plane scattered around, seats twisted, and pieces of the fuselage thrown in different directions. What was once an impeccable machine was now nothing more than rubble. I tried calling for my colleagues. "Claire, Emily, Captain Reynolds." My voice was weak, muffled by the distant sound of the crackling flames. I walked, staggering, trying to understand what had happened. There was no answer. Physical pain began to mix with panic. I was alone. The impact had been brutal, and the sight around me confirmed the worst. I was the only one standing there. I fought back tears as the shock began to set in. The adrenaline prevented me from fully processing the scale of the tragedy. Gradually, the sound of helicopters began to echo in the distance. Someone was coming. A feeling of relief filled me momentarily, but it was soon replaced by a wave of guilt. How could I be the only one to survive? And the others? My mind refused to accept it. With shaky legs, I knelt on the ground, among the wreckage. The silence around me felt deafening, broken only by the sounds of flames and creaking metal. It was the beginning of a long journey, not just of physical survival, but of dealing with the memories and trauma that day would bring to me forever. I will continue developing the story over the next few chapters. Each chapter will follow the same level of tension and excitement, with unexpected twists and challenges for the sole survivor. This will include struggles to find help, facing the difficulties of being alone and overcoming the trauma of having lost all colleagues and passengers. That silence, filled only by the distant sounds of the wreckage, was frighteningly deafening. I remained there, kneeling among the chaos, my mind running in circles trying to understand how this had happened. Reality was slowly starting to seep into my system. The plane had crashed, and I was the only one standing. I got up with difficulty, feeling pain all over my body. The right side of my abdomen was especially sore, likely a result of the impact. But adrenaline was still coursing through my veins, allowing me to temporarily ignore the physical pain. Shock was my biggest anesthetic at that moment. My clothes were torn, smelling of smoke and fuel, which made me cough from time to time. Still, I needed to move. I looked around, trying to find some sign of life. Maybe someone else was alive. Someone who had also survived. The first thought that came to my mind was Claire. She was the most experienced, always calm and collected in crisis situations. If anyone else could have survived, it would certainly be her. Emily, on the other hand, was so young, so full of life and dreams. Just thinking about the possibility that she hadn't made it made my stomach turn. I walked through what was left of the plane's central aisle, or at least what I could identify as that area. The seats were completely destroyed, many turned upside down, others completely disintegrated upon impact. The smell of burnt metal mixed with wet earth invaded my nostrils. What was once a smooth flight to Chicago now felt like a scene from a disaster movie, only it was real. All very real. At one point I tripped over something hard. I looked down and saw the body of one of the passengers still strapped to the seat. It was a woman, middle-aged, her expression frozen in terror. I forced myself to look away, feeling a wave of nausea rising in my throat. It was not the first victim I had encountered while walking, but the shock of seeing what was once a person full of life, now transformed into an inert body, was devastating. "Claire!" I shouted again, my voice echoing through the ruins of the plane. There was no answer. I continued my search, desperate for any sign of life. It was starting to become clear that maybe, just maybe, I was the only one. My mind refused to accept this. It couldn't be true. The distant sound of helicopters that I had heard before was gone, and now it was just me and the wreckage. I passed a part of the fuselage that was relatively intact, although dented and charred. As I approached, I heard a sound. Something. It wasn't a voice, but a faint noise, like a muffled moan. My heart raced. I ran toward the sound as fast as my exhausted body would allow. "Anyone there?" I screamed, trying to be heard. The sound was louder now, coming from a piece of twisted metal. I pulled out what I could, my hands shaking with fear and anticipation. When I managed to move the piece of fuselage, my eyes filled with hope. It was Emily. She was alive. Her face was covered in blood and she looked confused, but she was breathing. She opened her eyes slowly, blinking with difficulty until she recognized me. "Josh." His voice was weak, barely a whisper. "Emily, I'm here. It's going to be okay, I promise. I'm going to get you out of here," I said quickly, without thinking too much about the words. I wanted to believe it, I needed to believe it. But the truth was, I didn't know what to do. The scene around us was one of total destruction, but at least she was alive. I put my arms under her body and tried to lift her as best I could. She screamed in pain when I tried to move her, and it was only then that I realized her leg was trapped in the debris. A piece of metal was deeply embedded in his thigh, and as I tried to remove it, his scream made me stop immediately. "It's okay, Emily, I'll get help. I'll find a way out," I said, trying to sound more confident than I actually was. She nodded slightly, but her eyes showed fear. I looked around, trying to identify anything that could help me free her. There was debris everywhere, but nothing I could use as a tool. Desperate, I got up and started running through the wreckage. My mind raced at the same speed, searching for a solution. Maybe there was something in the cabin, I thought. I reached the front part of the plane, or what was left of it. The cockpit was almost unrecognizable, crushed against the ground. Captain Reynolds and Michael Thompson. I didn't even want to imagine the state they would be in. My stomach turned again. I couldn't waste time. I rummaged through everything I could, and then, almost miraculously, I found a metal bar that could serve as a lever. I ran back to where Emily was trapped. "I found this. I'm going to try to free you," he said, showing the metal bar. She closed her eyes, visibly scared, but she trusted me. "Hold on tight." I positioned the bar and started pressing against the piece of fuselage. The effort was enormous. Every muscle in my body screamed in pain, but I continued. I couldn't leave her there, not now that he had found someone. Finally, with a click, the metal gave way. Emily let out a muffled scream as the pressure on her leg eased. I quickly pulled her out of the wreckage. She was breathing hard, but she was free. I laid her gently on the floor as her body shook with exhaustion and pain. Let's get out of here," he said, trying to sound optimistic. But as I looked around, I knew the journey of survival was just beginning. Emily was lying on the ground, her body was shaking slightly, and her face was pale due to the intense pain. The metal bar had cut deeply into his leg, and even without advanced medical knowledge, I knew it needed to be treated urgently. Every second that passed increased the risk of infection, or worse, of her losing a lot of blood. I looked around for something I could use to stop the wound. My head was spinning. The accident, the despair of seeing so many lives lost around me, and now, the urgent need to find a solution. I found a first aid bag partially crushed among the debris. I hurried to open it, my hands shaking and covered in soot. There wasn't much there. A few bandages, a small pair of scissors, and a makeshift bandage, but it was all I had. It needed to be enough. "Emily, I need to stop the bleeding," I explained to her. Her response was a weak nod, her eyes half open, showing how exhausted she already was. With quick movements, I cut the part of the pant leg that was torn and exposed, revealing the wound. It was a difficult sight to process, but I couldn't afford to hesitate. I tied the piece of fabric around the thigh just above the wound and pulled with all the strength I could muster. Emily groaned in pain, and I had to look away for a second. I knew I was hurting her, but it needed to be done. With the bandage applied as best I could, I returned my focus to the surrounding scenery. Time felt like a cruel entity in that moment. The minutes stretched on, but urgency pulsed with every beat of my heart. "Let's get out of here," I said, more to myself than to her. I knew that if we stayed there, we would be exposed to a multitude of dangers: fire, smoke, unstable wreckage, and of course, the risk of not being found. The location where the plane had crashed was remote, and the little contact we had with traffic control before impact made me fear that no one knew exactly where we were. But how to move Emily without worsening her condition? I looked at her, and her breathing was ragged. I knew we couldn't stay there, but any movement could cause more damage. I got up, ignoring my own pain and the fatigue that was beginning to consume me, and looked for anything I could use as a makeshift stretcher. In the rubble nearby, I found one of the luggage compartment doors, a little dented but still intact. It was large and flat enough to support Emily. He would need strength, more strength than he thought he had, but that didn't matter. I pulled it out with difficulty, the metal creaking, dragging across the debris-strewn floor. Every step I took reminded me that I was alone in this. No backup, no immediate help, just me and my willpower. "Emily," I called in a firm but gentle voice. "I'm going to move you now, okay? It might hurt a little, but it's the only way we're going to get out of here." She opened her eyes for a brief moment, her lips quivering. "I'm confident in you, Josh," she whispered. And that silent confidence gave me an extra boost of determination. I needed to be strong, for myself and for her. Gently, I placed my arms under her body and lifted her, trying to avoid any sudden movements. She let out a moan, biting her lip to hold back the pain. I placed it carefully over the makeshift door and, with effort, began to pull the structure away from the wreckage. Each pull was a battle. The ground was uneven, with pieces of metal and luggage scattered everywhere. But I knew we needed to find a safer place, away from the risk of explosions or further collapse of the rubble. Time seemed to drag by as I advanced inch by inch. My entire body protested, muscles burning with exertion. My hands were dirty and scratched, and sweat mixed with the dirt on my skin. But I continued. Stopping was not an option. After what seemed like hours, I managed to drag Emily to a relatively safe place, a small open space surrounded by trees. The area was isolated enough to avoid further falling debris, but I knew we were far from any rescue. I knelt beside her, panting, and looked around, searching for something. Anything that might be a sign of hope. "Josh, what now?" Emily asked in a weak voice, her eyes half open. I didn't have an immediate answer. The truth is, I didn't know what would come next. We were alone, lost in the middle of nowhere. We needed help, but how long would it take to be found? Did anyone know we were alive? Now we rest, I replied, trying to cover my uncertainty with a weak smile. You need strength, and so do I. I knew rest was just a small, momentary relief. Soon reality would return with a vengeance. We were in the middle of a forest alone, with limited supplies and injured. What came next would be a fight for survival that I never imagined I would face. But as Emily breathed beside me, I knew that somehow I would need to find a way to keep her alive. I couldn't fail. Not now. The distant noise of a helicopter returned, echoing through the trees. Maybe there was still hope. The sound of the helicopter cut through the oppressive silence of the forest. I looked up at the sky, my heart racing, searching for any sign that rescue was finally arriving. Every second felt like an eternity, and my hands were sweating with anxiety. I tried to get up, but tiredness pulled me back to the floor. The dense trees above us covered the sky, making it difficult to see where exactly the sound was coming from. "Emily, I think they're looking for us," he said with faint enthusiasm, trying to remain optimistic. But she didn't respond. His breathing was slower, which worried me deeply. The makeshift bandage on his leg was doing what it could, but it clearly wasn't enough. We needed medical help, and fast. The sound of the helicopter seemed more distant now. My hope began to fade. They were close, but not close enough. They probably couldn't see us, hiding under the trees. My mind was spinning, trying to find a solution. There was nothing concrete I could use to signal our presence. Even if I lit a fire, the dense trees would probably hide the smoke. Desperation began to consume me. "I won't let it end like this," I whispered to myself, trying to find strength where there wasn't much left. The sight of Emily there, vulnerable and fragile, gave me the boost I needed to keep going. I needed a way to get the helicopter's attention. He needed to get out of that dense vegetation and get to an open area where he could be seen. But how? Carrying Emily was out of the question. She was already too weak, and moving her again could worsen her condition. I knew that, as painful as it was, I would have to leave her there for a moment. "Emily, I need you to stay here, okay? I'll try to find a way to get them to see us." My voice was calm, but my heart was in pieces. She could barely open her eyes, but she nodded slightly, signaling that she understood. I took a deep breath and started walking towards the sound of the helicopter. The terrain was rough, full of broken branches and pieces of metal that had been thrown far from the impact site. Each step required monumental effort. My body was exhausted, my head was throbbing, but I knew I needed to keep going. The sound of the helicopter was my only ray of hope. As I walked away, the fear of leaving Emily behind grew. What if something happened while I was gone? What if she needed me? These thoughts tormented me, but I tried to push them away. If I couldn't get her attention, she wouldn't have a chance. Me either. After a few minutes of walking, I found a small clearing. The sound of the helicopter was a little louder here. I needed to do something quickly. I searched the surroundings, looking for anything that could reflect sunlight, anything that could serve as a signal. It was then that I found a large piece of metal from the plane, still attached to one of the destroyed luggage. I picked it up and held it up toward the sun, trying to make the glow of the reflection visible from the sky. I waved the piece of metal frantically as the helicopter approached. My heart was in my throat. "Here! Down here!" I shouted as if my voice could make any difference. I continued to move the piece of metal, praying that the pilots would see the reflection. The helicopter was flying low, and for a moment it seemed like they were slowing down. My eyes burned from looking at the sky. The seconds passed like hours. And then, as the helicopter turned and began to move away, a deep despair came over me. They hadn't seen me. I was there, so close to being saved, but still invisible to them. I fell to my knees in the clearing without strength. The helicopter was moving away, taking with it the hope that I had cultivated in the last few hours. Tears began to stream down my face, mixing with the sweat and dirt. The reality was relentless. We were alone. For a few minutes I stood there, not knowing what to do. The silence returned, now heavier than before. I couldn't afford to give up. Not yet. Emily needed me. I wiped my face with my dirty shirt sleeve and got up. I needed to get back to her, make sure she was okay. Maybe there were other ways to save us. As I walked back to where I had left Emily, a single certainty formed in my mind. I couldn't count on anyone to rescue us. If we were to survive, we would need to find our own way out of this nightmare. The sound of the helicopter still echoed in the distance, but it no longer brought the comfort it used to. Now it was just the two of us against the unknown. The road back to Emily was long. Each step felt heavier than the last. The helicopter was now just a distant memory, and the silence around me added to the feeling of isolation. The trees closed in on me, and the physical fatigue began to turn into a mental burden. But the thought that Emily was still there, waiting, forced me to move on. I needed to get back to her. When I finally arrived at the place where I had left her, my heart gave a leap of relief when I saw her still conscious. She was lying down, her eyes half open, breathing hard. The makeshift bandage he had made was soaked with blood, and his pale face told me that time was running out. I knew we could no longer depend on a miracle rescue. We needed a new plan. Emily. I knelt down beside her, holding her hand gently. The helicopter didn't see us. We have to do something on our own. She slowly turned her head towards me, her eyes watering with pain and exhaustion. What are we going to do? His voice was weak, almost a whisper. I didn't have a clear answer. We needed to get out of there, get help, or find something that could keep her alive longer. I'll look for something useful, water, food, maybe we can improvise a shelter. She just nodded with no energy to argue or question. I carefully set her down again and stood up, trying to think of what to do. He knew that moving Emily again without finding something to stabilize her would be dangerous, but leaving everything to chance was even worse. I looked around. The area we were in was dense, but nearby was a clearing that I hadn't yet fully explored. Maybe there was something he could use for signage, or if he was lucky, some water source. With tired legs, I started walking towards the clearing, watching for any sign of danger or opportunity. The forest seemed endless, but after walking for a few minutes, I noticed that the terrain was starting to gently slope down. A light breeze passed through the trees, and I began to feel moisture in the air. It was a good sign. I continued walking, and soon I heard the soft sound of running water. My heart accelerated. Water meant hope. A few meters away, a small stream meandered through the trees. It was narrow but clean and ran steadily. I knelt down at the water's edge and wet my face, letting the coolness alleviate some of the tiredness. I took a few sips, feeling the invigorating liquid run down my throat. We needed that water. It was the first real victory since the accident. But then, something even more surprising caught my attention. Not far from the stream, a metallic shine reflected the sunlight. I approached cautiously, not knowing what to expect. As I got closer, I realized it was a larger part of the plane, probably a piece of the fuselage that had separated on impact. It was a relief to see him as he looked relatively intact. If there was something useful there, it might help us survive a little longer. As I got closer, I noticed that there were some suitcases scattered around. Most were destroyed or open, but some appeared intact. I rummaged through what I could, hoping to find food or some equipment I could use. The first suitcase had nothing useful in it, just torn clothes and personal items. But on Monday I found something that almost made me cry with relief. A survival kit. It was simple but complete. There was a knife, waterproof matches, a thermal blanket, and most importantly, a first aid kit more complete than the one I had found before. With the items in hand, I quickly returned to Emily, feeling a glimmer of hope rekindle within me. When I reached her, I was already weaker, but now with a new purpose. I knelt down next to her again and got to work. I removed the makeshift bandage and, more carefully, cleaned the wound on his leg with what I found in the kit. She groaned in pain, but tried to hold on. The new bandage was more suitable, and I wrapped her in the thermal blanket to keep her body warm as the night's chill began to descend on us. "You did all this by yourself?" she asked, her voice cracked with pain but with a hint of surprise. "I'm not alone," I replied, trying to smile. But the seriousness of the situation still weighed heavily. "We're in this together." She closed her eyes for a moment, breathing deeply. I knew she was exhausted, but at least we were a little more prepared. The water in the creek was only a few minutes away, and we now had enough resources to survive another few hours or even a day. As the sun began to set, silence reigned in the forest again. I looked at Emily and felt a rush of overwhelming responsibility. She trusted me to keep her alive, and I would do everything in my power to make sure we made it out alive. But as night fell, a new fear began to grow within me. The forest was not just a hostile environment. It hid dangers that I didn't yet know. And in that darkness, I knew that the real fight for survival was just beginning. Night fell with frightening rapidity, and the darkness of the forest brought with it a new kind of silence, heavy and oppressive. I felt vulnerable in a way I had never experienced. The forest around us, which had already seemed threatening in daylight, now became completely unfamiliar and potentially dangerous territory. We were alone, surrounded by the unknown, and every sound, no matter how small, seemed amplified by the night. I approached Emily, who was asleep, breathing raggedly. His face was still pale, but the improvised bandage from the first aid kit seemed to be working, at least temporarily. The thermal blanket kept his body warm, but I knew it wouldn't last forever. We needed to find a way to be rescued soon, or their chances of survival would quickly diminish. My own eyes were heavy with tiredness, but the idea of sleep was unthinkable. I needed to stay alert, watch for both of us. I didn't know what might appear in the darkness, wild animals, or even other hidden dangers of the forest. And more than that, he needed to monitor Emily's condition. Every time his breathing seemed to falter, my heart jumped with anxiety. The fire I managed to light with the waterproof matches from the survival kit was small, but it provided the minimum light and heat we needed. The orange glow flickered, casting distorted shadows on the trees around us. The flames crackled softly, creating a momentary feeling of comfort amidst the chaos we were experiencing. But my fear that the fire would attract the attention of nocturnal predators kept me uneasy. I knew it was a fine line. Without fire, we would freeze, but with it, we could attract something we didn't want to face. Fatigue dragged me towards exhaustion, but fear and responsibility kept me standing. I couldn't leave Emily alone, not in this state. I decided to walk around the makeshift camp, keeping the fire in my sights as I listened for any strange sounds in the darkness. The forest was alive, but its natural sounds now blended into the unsettling silence that surrounded us. As the hours progressed, the early morning chill began to intensify. The thermal blanket helped Emily, but my body was exposed to the plummeting temperature. I moved closer to the fire, trying to absorb the heat from the flames. My muscles were stiff and every movement felt like an immense effort. Hunger was beginning to set in, but I knew there wasn't enough food for both of us. What little we had would need to be rationed, and Emily had priority. Sitting by the fire, I fingered the survival kit knife. It wasn't big, but it was sharp enough to serve as a weapon if something or someone approached. With each crack in the forest, my hand tightened on the handle of the knife, my nerves on edge. The sounds of insects and small nocturnal animals, which had previously seemed normal, now sounded like invisible threats. It was then that I suddenly heard a different sound, a heavier rustling, something bigger than a simple small animal. My eyes darted to the trees around us, searching for the source of the sound. My heart raced, and I instinctively jumped to my feet, holding the knife tightly. The campfire cast dancing shadows, making it difficult to distinguish what was real from what was just my imagination. "Who's there?" I whispered into the darkness, not really expecting a response. Maybe it was the wind, I tried to convince myself, but the sound came again, closer this time. The sound of branches breaking under something heavy echoed in the night, and I started to move, trying to identify what was coming towards us. The sound was all around. It seemed to come from different directions, and my mind was already confused with tiredness and fear. Suddenly, something emerged from the shadows. My eyes widened as I saw a human figure slowly approaching, staggering through the trees. My body froze for a moment, and panic took over. Who would it be? Another survivor? A stranger? My thoughts raced, and I gripped the knife tighter. The figure advanced slowly, feet dragging along the ground until the firelight revealed its face. It was Claire. My colleague, Claire, who I had already given up for dead. She was alive. "Claire!" I screamed, not believing my eyes. She looked exhausted, covered in soot and looking lost, but alive. I quickly knelt beside her as she dropped to her knees by the fire. I was weak and hurt, but his eyes found me, and I saw a glimmer of relief. Tears streamed down her face as she tried to speak. I didn't think that there was no one else." His voice was hoarse and weak. "I also thought there was no one left. But now, the group of survivors had increased to 3. However, this also brought new challenges. We needed more resources, more care, and above all, more hope to survive together. Claire was there, alive, but on the verge of collapse. His body shook with exhaustion, covered in cuts and bruises. She knelt beside the fire, her face still marked by the pain and trauma of the accident. For a moment, the joy of finding another survivor was what kept me going, but soon reality set in. I knew rescue was still a long way off, and one more survivor meant one more life I needed to fight for. "Claire, you're hurt," I said, trying to keep my voice steady despite the fear rising inside me. "I'll take care of you, but we need to think quickly. We don't have many resources." She nodded slowly, her breathing heavy and ragged. Her eyes were lost, as if she was still trying to process what had happened. I helped her lie down next to Emily, who was still asleep, her skin pale as wax, the bandage on her leg soaked with blood. With each passing minute, Emily's situation became more critical. I sat next to them, feeling the weight of the 2 lives that now depended on me. The first aid kit, which had previously seemed like a miracle, now proved insufficient. Claire had deep wounds on her arms and was dehydrated and exhausted. Emily, on the other hand, was on the verge of a complete breakdown. And I, in the midst of it all, felt helpless. The night seemed endless. The darkness around us was as oppressive as the challenges we faced. The fire was getting smaller, and I knew I would need to get more wood, but tiredness and exhaustion were taking over me. We needed a plan. "Claire," I whispered, trying not to startle her, "do you know of anyone else? Did anyone else survive?" She shook her head slightly, the pain clear in her expression. "I saw bodies. Lots of bodies. But I couldn't find anyone. Until now." His voice was low, weak, and I could feel the deep sadness in his words. "I think we're the only ones." Those words were a blow. I already suspected, but hearing this from Claire solidified the fact that the chance of finding other survivors was slipping away. The weight of responsibility intensified. I needed to keep Claire and Emily alive somehow. The hours dragged on, and the forest around us seemed to close in on us. With every crack in the trees, with every movement in the bushes, my body braced itself for the worst. I knew we were in unknown territory, and with every second the feeling of danger intensified. The forest seemed more alive at night, with sounds I couldn't identify, and the darkness made everything more ominous. However, the greatest danger was there next to me. I needed to act quickly to keep Emily stable and tend to Claire's injuries. But the blunt truth was that we had no more supplies, and my energy was almost gone. As the sun began to rise over the horizon, bathing the forest in a dim light, something in me awakened. We couldn't continue like this. We needed to move, find a safer place or something that could draw attention to a possible rescue. I decided that we would leave that place at noon, whatever the cost. "Claire," I said, my voice steady despite my tiredness, "we will need to move. I know you're hurt, but we can't stay here. Emily needs more help than I can give. We have to try to find a more open area, something that makes it easier to be seen." She looked at me, her eyes full of pain, but there was understanding there. She knew I was right. Standing still was not an option. We needed a more open area, a place where we could be found. Maybe, with luck, we would still be on the search route. "I'll help you up," he said, holding out his hand to her. Claire held my hand with difficulty and with effort stood up. His movements were slow, each step a fight against pain. But she was strong. I could see it in his eyes. She wanted to survive. The biggest challenge would be Emily. His condition was getting worse by the minute. When I tried to wake her up, her eyes opened for just a few seconds before closing again. Her body heat was fading, and I knew her time was running out. If we didn't move now, she wouldn't survive. I tied the thermal blanket around Emily, and, with Claire's help, we placed her on a kind of makeshift stretcher made from branches in the fuselage door. The effort was enormous, but we did it. It was the only way to take her without worsening her injuries. With Claire by my side, we began moving through the forest. The terrain was difficult, and with each step I felt the weight of the two women who depended on me. The silence between us was broken only by the sound of our feet crunching dry leaves and twigs. The fear was constant, but the hope of finding a way out was the only thing that kept us standing. As we progressed, my mind raced with questions I still couldn't answer. Were we alone? Would there be a chance of surviving? I didn't know. But for now I kept walking, because stopping would mean giving up, and I wasn't ready for that. Not yet. The sound of our footsteps echoed in the forest as we slowly advanced, dragging Emily's frail body onto the makeshift stretcher. Every meter covered felt like a battle, and the burden of caring for two lives was becoming unbearable. The thick forest air was heavy on my lungs and my legs were shaking with exhaustion, but stopping was not an option. With each step I repeated to myself that we needed to move forward. Just a few more meters. Just one more effort. Claire stood beside me, silent, focusing her last energy on helping carry Emily. His face was pale, and his movements, once steady, were becoming slower and slower. I knew she was also at her limit, but the desperation of survival drove us to continue. The sun was already high in the sky, but its light barely penetrated the dense treetops, creating a constant gloom around us. The forest seemed endless, and with each turn the hope of finding an open area or some sign of civilization diminished. The reality of the situation was becoming painfully clear. Our strength was running out, and unless something changed quickly, the worst would happen. "Josh, I don't know how much longer I can," Claire said hoarsely, her words ragged with labored breathing. She paused for a moment, leaning over Emily's gurney, her eyes fixed on the floor. "Emily. She won't make it." I looked at Emily. His body was still and his breathing was weak, almost imperceptible. The bandage on his leg was no longer enough to stop the bleeding, and the cold seemed to have taken over his body. The hard truth I had been trying to ignore finally hit me full force. Emily was dying, and I couldn't do anything to save her. "We have to keep going," I replied, my voice sounding strangely calm, as if I were saying it more to myself than to Claire. "We can't stop now." Claire looked at me, her eyes teary, but she didn't say anything. She knew as I did that we were fighting the inevitable. Still, we stood up again and continued walking because the only other option was to give up. And that wasn't something we were ready to do. The silence between us was broken only by the sound of Emily's breathing, now irregular and agonizing. I knew she couldn't take much more. With every minute, his body seemed to lose the battle against the cold, pain, and fatigue. My mind was filled with confusing thoughts, questions that had no answers, and the growing feeling that time was running out. As the sun began to set again with golden light breaking through the treetops, we stopped in a small clearing. It wasn't the open area I'd expected, but it was the closest to shelter we'd found in hours. Claire and I, exhausted, left Emily lying on the leaf-covered ground. I sat next to her, watching her breathing hitch, feeling a mixture of helplessness and despair. Claire walked over and placed her hand on Emily's shoulder, tears silently rolling down her face. "She's leaving," he whispered, his voice broken with pain. And at that moment I knew there was nothing more we could do. I stood there watching as life slowly left Emily's body. Her face, once so full of life and enthusiasm, was now pale and serene, as if she had finally found peace. The moment was devastating, and my mind tried in vain to process the loss. I tried to convince myself that we did everything we could, but the truth was painful. I failed. I couldn't save her. Claire collapsed next to me, her body racked with sobs. I felt tears burning in my eyes, but I couldn't cry. I was numb, caught between shock and deep pain. The weight of being the only one to witness Emily's end crushed me, and for a brief moment, I wished it would all end there. But, as if the forest knew we needed one last stroke of luck, a distant sound broke the silence. An engine. I stood up quickly, eyes fixed on the horizon. Claire heard it too and looked at me, with a mixture of hope and disbelief on her face. The sound approached. A vehicle. Someone was nearby. "Josh, did you hear that?" Claire murmured, a spark of hope in her voice. I nodded, heart racing. Yes, I heard. Adrenaline was rushing through my body again. It could be our last chance for survival. Without wasting any more time, I ran towards the sound, leaving Claire next to Emily's body. I knew there was no more time to waste. My only hope now was to find whoever it was and bring them in to save us. With every step I took, the sound of the engine became louder, and for the first time in a long time, hope throbbed in my chest again. I ran with all the strength I had left in my body, the sound of the engine echoing through the trees growing louder with each step. The heart beat so fast I could hear it in my ears, and hope, once extinguished, now pulsed with fierce intensity. The only thing that moved me at that moment was the possibility of saving Claire. And finally, surviving. As the sound grew louder, I saw a narrow dirt road materialize ahead. It was something I didn't expect to find in the middle of that nightmare. A small jeep, old and covered in dust, drove slowly along the path. My eyes widened. It was real. The help was there, so close it almost hurt. "Help!" I shouted, my voice hoarse, raising my arms, waving frantically as I ran towards the vehicle. The driver, a middle-aged man with a surprised look, stopped the jeep abruptly when he saw me emerge from the forest. He got out of the car quickly, his expression shocked when he saw me covered in dirt, exhausted and with a face marked by despair. "My God, what happened?" he asked as he approached. "We have a plane crash," I replied, trying to catch my breath. "There's someone else. Claire, she's hurt. We need help, fast." The man nodded and ran back to the jeep, grabbing an old radio. He communicated with someone in heavily accented English. I couldn't understand everything, but the words rescue team and plane were clear. Within minutes, he assured them that help was on the way. Relief coursed through my body like a balm, but it wasn't over yet. We needed to get back to Claire. I ran back through the forest with the man right behind me. When we arrived at the small makeshift camp where Claire was still sitting next to Emily's lifeless body, a wave of emotion hit me again. The sadness, failure, and exhaustion of it all, mixed with the relief of knowing that at least one of us could survive. Claire raised her head when she heard our footsteps. His eyes were swollen and red, and the expression on his face was one of pure, emotional exhaustion. Did they come?" she asked, her voice weak, barely believing the words she was saying. "Yes," I replied, kneeling beside her, holding her hands tightly. "Help is on the way. We did it, Claire." The man accompanying me looked at Emily, and the sadness in his eyes was evident. He approached Claire, quickly examining her injuries, and assured her that she would be taken to the hospital as soon as rescuers arrived. The next few minutes were a blur. I was so exhausted I could barely process everything around me. The rescue team finally arrived, bringing doctors, rescuers, and emergency vehicles. Claire was placed on a stretcher, her injuries treated as she was prepared to be transported by helicopter. Emily's body, now wrapped in a blanket, would also be taken away, a silent tribute to those who were unable to escape. As I watched everything, I felt a mixture of emotions that were impossible to describe. There was relief that we had been found, but also a deep sadness for the loss of Emily and for the others who didn't survive the accident. The void left by the tragedy was immense, and the guilt weighed on me like an anchor. I was the only one left, the last one who could tell this story. After all the rescue procedures, I was taken with Claire to the helicopter. The wind from the propellers whipped my face, but I didn't care. We were climbing, finally leaving that nightmare behind. I looked at Claire, who had her eyes closed, breathing hard but alive. That moment felt unreal. Surviving that hell seemed like an impossible miracle. The hours that followed in the hospital were confusing. We were treated by caring doctors and nurses, our bodies and minds trying to recover from the trauma we had suffered. Claire was seriously injured, but doctors assured her that she would recover in time. But Emily, she was always on my mind. Even as they tried to reassure me, the weight of their loss stayed with me. I knew that nothing could bring her back, and that truth was like a deep cut that I would have to carry for the rest of my life. Days later, as I was preparing to leave the hospital, one of the doctors entered the room, carrying some papers. "You were very brave," he said, his tone serious and compassionate. "Not everyone would have withstood what you went through." I nodded, but couldn't say anything. Courage to me meant little when so many lives were lost. I had survived, but at a cost I could not forget. I looked out the hospital window, watching the world continue to spin. The forest, the accident, the deaths. All of that was still so present in my mind, as if I were trapped in that moment. I was last, the only survivor. I never imagined I would survive something like this. I lost friends, people I considered my family, and although the pain is still deep, I learned that life is fragile and precious. Every second counts. If I'm here today, it's because somehow I found the strength within myself to continue even when everything seemed lost. The truth is, no matter how much darkness surrounds us, there is always a spark of hope waiting to be found. And if I learned anything from this experience, it's that life is always worth living, even in the most difficult moments. Cherish the ones you love, fight for each day, and never give up. I didn't give up.
If this story captured and moved you, don't forget to like the video, share with those who love intense stories like this, and subscribe to our channel. Your participation is essential for us to continue bringing more narratives that will surprise you and stir your emotions. Don't miss the next chapter of this incredible journey.